NBC News has confirmed that the House Intelligence Committee has subpoenaed White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney for a previously scheduled deposition before the Impeachment Investigating Committee tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. That deposition had been scheduled, but the delivery of the subpoena tonight is a new development. We'll have more on that in a moment. Donald Trump wanted to hear the words Biden and Clinton from the president of Ukraine. We know that now. He wanted to hear those words, Biden and Clinton, in a public announcement by President Zelensky that Ukraine was investigating Biden and Clinton. That is the under oath testimony of George Kent that we will be hearing in public next week in the first televised hearings of the impeachment inquiry. The transcript of George Kent's closed-door deposition was released today. Also today, the impeachment inquiry conducted its first closed-door deposition of a member of the vice president's staff. Jennifer Williams is an advisor to Mike Pence on Europe and Russia. None of her testimony has yet been released. George Kent is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Ukraine is in his departmental jurisdiction, which gave George Kent a close-up view of what he said under oath was Rudy Giuliani's campaign of lies about Ukraine, a campaign that Rudy Giuliani says he conducted entirely on behalf of the President of the United States. George Kent is one of the witnesses, along with the acting ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, whose testimony forced Gordon Sondland to change his under oath testimony to try to avoid perjury charges. Gordon Sondland, Donald Trump's completely inexperienced and incompetent ambassador to the European Union, added a 4-page written supplement to the transcript of his written deposition, saying that he now agrees with Ambassador William Taylor's testimony and George Kent's testimony after reports of their testimony had helped him refresh his memory. George Kent testified under oath that Gordon Sondland told him that Donald Trump, quote, wanted nothing less than President Zelensky to go to a microphone and say investigations, Biden and Clinton. Those were the magic words. Those were the words Donald Trump had to hear before he would hand over military aid to Ukraine. Investigations, Biden and Clinton. Ukraine's survival depended on those 3 words, investigations, Biden and Clinton. But as George Kent's testimony shows, President Zelensky, even though he was new at his job, realized how wrong it would be for him to say those words. President Zelensky's staff made it very clear to George Kent that they understood how wrong it would be for President Zelensky to be forced to say those words, and how wrong it would be for President Zelensky to be forced to investigate American political rivals of the President of the United States. George Kent was warned by Ukrainian officials that Rudy Giuliani was working in the shadows to try to control American-Ukraine policy. The Ukrainian Minister of the Interior told George Kent that Giuliani's method was to throw mud. Quote, and I said, throw mud at whom? And he said, a lot of people. I asked him whom, and he said, towards Masha, towards you, towards others. Question, Masha is Marie Yovanovitch? Kent, former Ambassador Yovanovitch, yes. George Kent provided hours of details about Rudy Giuliani's activities, which George Kent referred to under oath repeatedly as, quote, a continuation of his campaign of lies. Rudy Giuliani can sue George Kent for those words, can sue him for defamation, for calling Rudy Giuliani a liar, conducting a campaign of lies. Giuliani could sue if and only if George Kent is not telling the truth and the full truth about Rudy Giuliani. But Rudy Giuliani will not sue George Kent. George Kent's description of Rudy Giuliani's campaign of lies now lives in the congressional record forever. But Rudy Giuliani could find himself in a courtroom because of his campaign of lies. Rudy Giuliani is now the subject of a criminal investigation of his activities, which has already resulted in the indictment of 2 associates of Rudy Giuliani. Mr. Giuliani spent the last few weeks searching desperately for a criminal defense lawyer to represent him and being repeatedly rejected by a number of high-powered attorneys before finally landing on Robert Costello, who served as an intern for Rudy Giuliani when Rudy Giuliani was the head of the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, the same office that is currently investigating him. And of course, the life lesson is always be nice to the interns. You never know when you're going to need them. Leading off our discussion tonight is Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. He's a member of the House Intelligence Committee and the House Judiciary Committee. He attended George Kent's deposition, and he attended Jennifer Williams' deposition today. Congressman Swalwell, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I want to begin for a moment with...
Of course. And Lawrence is a former congressional intern. That advice is absolutely right.
I knew that was coming. That's a good word for the interns. Jennifer Williams testifying today. What can you tell us about her willingness to testify and what resistance was put up or not in getting her to testify?
Well, I'll address what Rachel read earlier and what you alluded to in the opening, the concerns expressed by Anonymous. Well, Anonymous talks a lot about the adults in the room, and I would suggest the adults in the room respond to lawful subpoenas. And today, Jennifer Williams was one of the adults in the room. She showed up, and that in and of itself is helpful. And every time a witness has shown up, we've learned new information to fill in the timeline and understand who was a part of the defense dollars for dirt scheme and who was doing honest foreign policy work on behalf of the United States. And so we filled that in. We're ready to move into these open hearings next week. And Ms. Williams, I thank her and so many others who have bravely served our country, but have been patriots when their country needed them to respond to a lawful subpoena.
George Kent, I asked, what can you tell us about what she might have added to your understanding of the case today? Well,
Ms. Williams, worked for the vice president in the same role that, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman worked for the president. And so, in many ways, it's, corroborating what you hear from other witnesses. And Lawrence, if she said something today that exonerated the president or was an arrow pointing in the opposite direction of where all the arrows are pointing in this scheme, I could tell you that. But that's not what occurred. We saw more corroboration of this shakedown scheme from President Trump. But also, to your point about Rudy Giuliani, we now have a number of witnesses who have described Rudy Giuliani being told to them by President Trump as Rudy is our guy in Ukraine. So you have this agency relationship between Rudy Giuliani and President Trump, a sharp, straight line between the two of them. So even if Rudy Giuliani is carrying out, some foreign policy position, that is Donald Trump's foreign policy position, and the two are inseparable.
When you look at George Kent's testimony and recognizing that he's going to be one of the public witnesses next week, one of the things I noticed in the release of the deposition transcript today, as with every one of them, is that the Democrats release a summary of highlights of the testimony that the Democrats want us and everyone to focus on. Those are elements that you believe make the case or direct where the case is going. The Republicans issue no highlights for any of the depositions. In other words, there are no lines in these depositions, not a single line, that the Republicans want us to concentrate on, want us to report to the American people. And when you read the depositions, you see why. There isn't a single moment where the Republicans make any kind of defense of Donald Trump.
That's right, Lawrence, and that's why it was so disingenuous for the past few weeks that they've suggested that if the public only saw the transcripts, they would see how innocent the president was in this scheme. Actually, it was more harmful to us that the public was not seeing the transcripts as we took on all of this incoming from the Republicans as they made their process attacks, when in fact, if they had seen the transcripts at that time, the public would have understood that there is a fair process. The facts are very, very concerning, what we're seeing here. And so, we will move now to public hearings. And it's my hope, Lawrence, that the Republicans get serious. This is a serious allegation against the President of the United States, an extortion scheme, and it's time for them to start acting like the adults in the room.
Before you go, we know they're not going to get serious. That's a good thing to say. It's not going to happen. We know they're going to try to create as much of a circus atmosphere as possible because all they have is diversionary circus tactics because they can't deal with the evidence. Is there planning going on among the Democrats about how to deal with the chaos that the Jim Jordans and others, if they're in the room, will try to create?
Chaos is a consciousness of guilt. And if they want to bring chaos to the proceedings, Lawrence, as people in uniform, wounded warriors, immigrants to the United States, public servants, raise their right hand and tell the truth about what this president did, the public will look at the seriousness of these witnesses compared to the stunts by the Republicans, and they'll say they're only doing this because they have a guilty client that they're trying to defend. But again, as I've said to you before on the show, Lawrence, they are not the public defenders to the President of the United States. They are representatives to their constituents, and they have a duty to the Constitution. And again, they have a reset opportunity next week to start conducting themselves that way.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.